For many years, I've worked as a forest ranger in the vast and diverse forests of Oregon, cherishing the wilderness for its incredible variety. In Timber Ridge, the towering Douglas firs reach skyward, and the forest floor is blanketed with a complex tapestry of ferns, shrubs, wildflowers, and mosses. Every time I enter the forest and uncover a new vista, it feels like I'm discovering something entirely new. A red-tailed hawk glides gracefully above me, and I watch every movement it makes. Then I realize it's hunting, searching for prey to bring back to its family. If a wildfire were to sweep through the forest, destroying everything in its path, a significant portion of our natural heritage would be lost forever. However, a few weeks ago, something unusual happened that I must share with you. I was on my routine patrol in Timber Ridge. The towering trees and dense canopy blocked out most of the sunlight. The forest floor was cushioned with a soft layer of moss, lichens, and ivy, with intertwined roots and fallen logs creating fascinating pathways. The air was filled with the fragrant scent of pine needles and wildflowers, and the songs of birds echoed through the woods. A profound silence enveloped the forest, broken only by the rustling of leaves, the gentle babbling of streams, and the calls of various woodland creatures. Occasionally, I heard distant thunder rumble or a branch snap under my feet. Everywhere I looked, there was beauty and tranquility. As I ventured deeper into the forest on my ATV, I noticed smoke in the air. My mind filled with concern that a wildfire had broken out. Cautiously, I approached the scent of smoke and hid amidst the dense foliage. To my astonishment, I discovered an entire village that had remained hidden until now. I could hardly believe that people lived in such a remote part of Oregon. A small, peculiar village lay deep within the forest. The buildings were constructed from timber and stone, as if they had grown directly from the earth. The village was encircled by towering trees that shielded it from prying eyes. The residents moved slowly and cautiously, as though afraid of being discovered. A thin wisp of smoke rose into the air, indicating that a fire had been lit at the center of the village. A sense of mystery surrounded the settlement, igniting my desire to explore further. As I pushed through the underbrush, the village seemed untouched by the modern world. To my surprise, I was greeted by a group of friendly villagers who welcomed me with open arms. "Hello, I'm Emma Thompson, Forest Ranger. It's a pleasure to meet all of you," I said. The villagers smiled and invited me into their modest home. "We're honored to have you here, Emma. Please come with us. We'd like to offer you some tea," one of the villagers responded. I followed them into a cozy cabin, where I noticed an unusual tradition. The villagers always walked backward when entering or leaving a building. "I've noticed that you all walk backward when you enter or leave a building. Is there a reason for that?" I asked, curiously. The villagers exchanged glances, and then one spoke up. "Yes, it's a tradition passed down through generations. We believe that walking backward brings us good fortune and keeps evil spirits at bay." I nodded in understanding and sat down at the table, where I was served a cup of herbal tea made from forest plants. As I sipped the warm beverage, I began a conversation with the villagers. "I have to say, I'm quite amazed by this place. How long have you been living here?" I inquired. "Many generations. We've always lived here and never had contact with outsiders," one of the villagers replied. This statement surprised me greatly. It was hard to believe that such a secluded village had managed to survive without any contact with the outside world, let alone that I, as a forest ranger, had never encountered it before. "That's impressive. How do you manage to sustain yourselves?" I continued. "We have our own land and cultivate it according to our needs. We also gather food from the forest and the nearby river," another villager answered. As we continued to chat and drink tea, I felt a deep sense of peace and calm within the village. It was a stark contrast to the hectic pace of city life. During our conversation, I took out my pocket mirror to check the color of my lipstick. Before I could bring it to my face, I noticed a disturbance in the room, followed by a few glances as they realized what it was. Even in the dim light of the room, I could see that the residents wanted me to put it away. It was very strange, and I couldn't help but ask, "Excuse me, is something wrong with my mirror?" The villagers looked at each other nervously, and then one spoke up. "We don't like mirrors in this house. They bring us bad luck and attract negative energies." I was taken aback by their reaction but tried to hide my surprise. "Really? I've never heard that before. Can you tell me more about it?" The villagers hesitated for a moment, then opened up and shared their beliefs with me. In our culture, mirrors are considered portals to another world and can attract spirits and ghosts. We avoid them as much as possible. I nodded slowly to respect their beliefs, but couldn't help wondering why they were so afraid of mirrors. I decided to change the subject and asked them about their hobbies and interests. As we talked, I kept glancing at my mirror, but the villagers maintained their distance from it. It was as if they were afraid to touch or even look at it. I agreed and left the cabin, still puzzled by their beliefs regarding mirrors. It was a strange experience, but also interesting to learn about the customs and beliefs of another culture. After a few minutes, I accepted their offer to explore the small village further. As I left the cabin, I immediately noticed something odd. None of the villagers had shadows. Even stranger was that their footsteps made no sound on the gravel paths. I froze and watched in amazement as they moved silently through the streets. One of the residents noticed my confusion and approached me. "Is everything all right?" he asked. I hesitated for a moment, trying to find the right words. I couldn't help but notice that you and your community members don't seem to have shadows," I finally said, hoping for a logical explanation. The resident shrugged. "It's just the way we are. We've always been this way for as long as we can remember." I was frustrated by his vague answers. "But how is that even possible?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The resident looked at me calmly. "We don't know. It's just part of our community's history and culture." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. It was like something out of a horror movie. I need to go," I stammered, feeling uneasy. As I walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling of fear lingering inside me. I had never experienced anything like this before. The more I thought about it, the more anxious I became. It was as if I had discovered a community of ghosts. I decided to go home and do some research on this community. At that moment, I noticed that one of the residents was watching me intently. He approached me and introduced himself as Jackson. "I heard that you want to learn more about our culture," he said with a friendly smile. "If you'd like, I can lead you deeper into the village and show you everything." I hesitated for a moment before agreeing. Jackson seemed nice enough, and I was curious to learn more. He guided me through the narrow streets, showing me various landmarks and explaining their significance. Eventually, we stopped in front of a large building, and he explained that it was a temple dedicated to the spirits of their community. It was a breathtaking sight. The temple was made of white stone and adorned with intricate carvings on the facade. The windows were made of stained glass depicting scenes from ancient mythology. We entered the temple, and I couldn't help but be impressed by its beauty. Everywhere I looked, there were statues and sculptures that seemed to come alive with every movement of light. The walls were decorated with colorful tapestries and paintings that told stories from long ago. As Jackson and I left the temple, I suddenly heard the ringing of bells in the distance. Confused, I turned to Jackson. "What kind of sound is that?" I asked. Jackson smiled at me. "Those are the bells that announce the beginning of the silent hour. For the next hour, no one in the village is allowed to speak or make noise. It's meant to help us attune ourselves to the energy of the forest." I was surprised by his explanation. "Wait, what? No one speaks for an hour?" I asked incredulously. Jackson nodded. "Yes, it's a tradition we've upheld for many years. It helps us connect with nature and find inner peace." I couldn't help but doubt the idea. "But how do you communicate during that time? What if there's an emergency?" Jackson chuckled softly. "We have our own ways of communicating without words. We use hand gestures and facial expressions, and if there's an emergency, we break the silence." As we walked through the village, I noticed that everyone was observing the silent hour. It was eerily quiet. Only the rustling of leaves and the occasional chirping of birds could be heard. I tried to remain calm, but it was difficult for me. I was used to talking and making sounds, and the silence made me uneasy. I couldn't shake the feeling of being punished, but the longer the hour lasted, the more I began to appreciate the village's silence and tranquility. It was like a peaceful oasis in the midst of a chaotic world. And when the hour ended and the villagers began to speak again, I felt a sense of relief and gratitude. Although it was strange and unfamiliar to me, I accepted the tradition and learned to appreciate the beauty of silence. It was a humbling experience that taught me to slow down and enjoy the present moment. After the silent hour ended, the village returned to its usual liveliness. People chatted and laughed. Children played, and the sounds of acoustic guitars and hand drums filled the air. I spent more time exploring the village, admiring its beauty, and talking with the residents. But the more time I spent with them, the more I noticed something odd. The people in the village seemed somehow different from anyone I had ever met. They spoke in a dialect that blended Old English with local vernacular, and their customs and beliefs were completely foreign to me. It was as if I had entered another world, one that didn't seem real. The more I explored, the more I felt like I was in a dream. The village seemed too perfect, too beautiful, too quiet. It was like a utopia, almost too good to be true. The residents seemed too calm, too peaceful, almost as if they were under a spell. It was as though they had no worries, no problems, no conflicts. I tried to ignore my unease and enjoy the beauty of the village, but the more I looked around, the more I felt like I was in a surreal world. It was like a movie set, where everything was perfect and flawless, but the messiness and complexity of real life were missing. As the day drew to a close, I realized that I needed to leave the village. It was too strange, too unreal, and I couldn't wait to return home. As it grew darker, I noticed that the villagers' eyes subtly glowed in the darkness. It was a strange sight that sent shivers down my spine. I turned to Jackson, who was standing beside me, and asked, "Why do your eyes glow like that?" Jackson looked at me, a hint of amusement in his eyes. "Our eyes have always been this way," he explained. "It's part of our biology. We can see in the dark, which is why we don't need lights in the village." I couldn't help but be startled by his answer. "You don't need lights because your eyes glow?" I asked, trying to make sense of it all. Jackson nodded. "Yes, that's correct. And we don't sleep either. We believe that sleep is a waste of time, and that we can achieve more by staying awake all the time." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. It was as if I had stumbled upon a village of nocturnal creatures. "You never sleep?" I asked, feeling more frightened than ever. Jackson smiled. "No, we don't. We spend our nights meditating and connecting with nature. I wanted to leave the village as quickly as possible. The lingering feeling of fear wouldn't leave me. It was as if I had discovered a community of beings that weren't entirely human. "I need to go," I said with a trembling voice. "Thank you for showing me everything." Jackson nodded understandingly. "Of course, it was nice having you here. Feel free to visit any time." I turned and walked away, feeling like I had escaped a nightmare. The experience was both fascinating and terrifying, and I couldn't wait to leave the village behind. I began to race on my ATV, desperate to leave the strange village. I felt watched, and I could sense the villagers' eyes on my back as I sped away. The darkness seemed to stretch out before me, and the stars shone brightly in the night sky. The forest was dark and eerie, with twisted trees that seemed to reach out to me. The only sounds were the roar of the ATV engine and the rustling of leaves in the wind. The night was silent and still, with no signs of life around me. As I drove deeper into Timber Ridge, the darkness seemed to close in, making it hard to see what lay ahead. I felt my heart pounding in my chest, and my palms were sweaty on the ATV handles. It was as if the forest was alive and watching me. The only thing keeping me going was the thought of leaving the forest and returning to civilization. I had never felt so alone and vulnerable, and I was desperate to get away as quickly as possible. As I continued driving, the forest seemed even more surreal. The trees were gnarled and twisted, and the shadows appeared to move and shift in the dark. It was like a nightmare come to life, and I couldn't help but wonder if I would ever make it out alive. But then I saw a light flickering in the ranger station, and my heart leapt with hope. It was a sign of civilization, and I knew I was getting closer to safety. With renewed energy, I sped toward the light, determined to return home. The forest might be eerie and intimidating, but I was stronger than my fear and knew I could make it. When I arrived at the ranger station, a wave of relief washed over me. I saw my colleague, John Miller, sitting at the reception desk, working on his computer. When he looked up and saw me, his expression changed from surprise to concern. "Are you okay?" he asked, noticing the pale and frightened look on my face. I shook my head, initially too scared to speak. Then I took a deep breath and recounted my experience in the strange village. John listened attentively, nodding occasionally as I described my encounters with the villagers. When I finished my story, John's grandfather, Mr. Frederick Miller, entered the office. He was an elderly man with a kind face and a gentle smile. He greeted me warmly and listened as I repeated my story. When I was done, the old man looked thoughtful. "I know the area you're talking about," he said slowly. "There used to be a village of hermits there. They had a close-knit community with their own customs and beliefs." A feeling of unease spread through me as he spoke. "What happened to them?" I asked in a trembling voice. The old man sighed. "They were struck by a natural disaster a long time ago. Their village was destroyed, and no survivors were found." A chill ran down my spine. The thought of encountering ghosts and spirits was too much for me, and I never had the courage to go back and find out. John placed a hand on my shoulder. "There are many stories about Timber Ridge," he said quietly. "Sometimes people just disappear and their legends live on. Maybe you encountered a remnant of those old tales." I nodded slowly, still uneasy but grateful for the explanation. Perhaps the village was just a remnant of old legends and misunderstandings. Still, I would never forget this experience. In the following weeks, the encounter kept replaying in my mind. I began researching the old legends of Timber Ridge, especially stories about hermit communities and mystical settlements that were said to live deep within the forest. Some of these stories spoke of hidden villages cut off from the modern world, maintaining their own traditions, often linked with nature spirits and ancient rituals. One evening, as I was finishing my report on the incident, I received a call from John. "Emma, please come by. I want to show you something." I drove to the ranger station and followed him to the old wooden shed behind the building. There, he showed me old maps and documents that referenced the mysterious village. It turned out that, decades ago, there were reports of a similar village that had disappeared after a severe storm. The hermits had retreated to the deepest parts of the forest to escape the turmoil of the outside world, and their existence was eventually forgotten. "Maybe you encountered a remnant of that community," John said thoughtfully. "There are many unexplained phenomena in Timber Ridge, and sometimes reality and myth blend together." I nodded and decided to accept my encounter as a blend of reality and the forest's ancient legends. Timber Ridge was a place full of secrets and stories, and I felt honored to have experienced a small part of it. Despite the uncertainties and my initial fear, the experience was enlightening. It reminded me of how deep and rich nature is, and how many secrets it still holds. Timber Ridge wasn't just a place of beauty, but also a keeper of old stories and mysteries waiting to be discovered. And so, I continued my work with a newfound understanding and respect for the forest's hidden wonders, always open to the stories it still had to tell. If you see me staring at you at night, run away. If you notice me staring at you in the middle of the night, run away. She had warned me on the very first night, but of course I didn't listen. Aunt May's house smells of a delightful blend of spices and herbs that she uses for cooking, home remedies, and making perfumes. Her home is by far the most imaginative place I've ever seen, filled with all sorts of mementos, both large and small. It's hard to recognize that the house even has walls because of all the large posters of old American towns and classic films, as well as traditional tapestries in vibrant purples and deep greens. My mother's older sister lives all alone. She never married, which has been a big topic in our family, but May doesn't worry about it. She has her own house, her own life, and makes all her own decisions. Her home truly deserves that word, but as soon as I leave the comfort of these colorful walls, her town, Raven Hollow, feels oppressive. I felt the tension of this place the moment I arrived at the train station. Everything was shrouded in a light fog, accompanied by an intense, foul smell that crawled down my throat. At first, I was excited to be here for a weekend to escape the city noise and spend a few days in a tiny town in Appalachia. It was almost May, the sun had returned, and I felt almost optimistic. I was relieved to be away from my parents, my brother, and even my new boyfriend for a while. The only strange thing was that it was my mother who had suggested the trip, even though she hated it when I had contact with May because she's a bad influence. But now I've learned that this place isn't a home, but an exile, and the sun doesn't really shine here, or at least you can hardly see it. I have no idea how the weather works here in general, but I'm sure it's not right to sit on a train for 6 hours and see only one place completely swallowed by gray. "Grace?" I heard a familiar voice calling me from the fog. Aunt May appeared, dressed in a long, airy skirt with at least 5 necklaces around her neck and 6 rings on her fingers. Her curly hair, dyed with henna, went in all directions. As she got close enough, she pulled me into a firm hug and gave me a kiss on each cheek. She smelled of lavender and roses. "Let's go inside, dear girl. You must be starving." My cheerful and energetic aunt had prepared stuffed grape leaves with rice and herbs, my favorite dish, as well as these amazing semolina dumplings, potato salad, and lentil soup. Very typical Appalachian dishes with a touch of her own culinary tradition. They weren't quite as good as my mother's, but I didn't tell her that. After dinner, we sat in the living room, drank tea, and talked about all sorts of things. School, friends, Nashville. After a while, I even told her about Noah, my boyfriend, but only because May is the only person in the family I can feel comfortable being open with. Everything was going almost perfectly. Inside her house, I almost forgot how eerie this town was. It was all great until it wasn't, until our conversation changed. May flipped her teacup, maybe for a tea leaf reading or perhaps just out of habit. "I've been wanting to talk to you for a while, sweetie. The last time you were here, you were, 6 or 7? I understand that your mother doesn't like the visits, but..." She paused. "But she's the one who brought me away from the city," probably wanted to say. "My mother believes that Aunt May casts a bad light on our family. She probably just doesn't like the smell. You know how sensitive she is." I tried to joke, but I couldn't look her in the eyes. I hated how my mother had given up on her. I can't stand my brother most of the time, and I wouldn't want to do that to him either. "Smell?" She raised an eyebrow. "Yes, it smells rotten. Kind of like burnt eggs and gasoline. I don't know. Not inside here, outside," I quickly added. Aunt May flipped her cup again. "Grace, when you were little, did your mother ever warn you about hill spirits?" she asked, ignoring what I had said about the smell. "Only the ones from old fairy tales," I laughed. But Aunt May's face didn't move an inch. My mother is a pretty religious person. Everything evil must be kept away. Ironic. They're quite unpredictable. They can change their shape. Not all of them are evil. Actually, our moral concepts don't quite apply to them, as far as I understand, but some like to cause people pain, and they're pretty good at it. She sighed. Some might find it ridiculous, but I'm very aware of them. I don't want to upset them, not even accidentally, and as long as you're here, I'd like you to respect that. Can you do that for me?" I had no idea where this sudden change in conversation was coming from, but Aunt May stared into my eyes without blinking even once. There was such intensity in it. I nodded. Maybe my aunt had gone a little crazy living all alone here. I know I would if I had to live in this secluded little town. I'm glad to hear that, sweetie. I've written down a few things. You can memorize them later, okay? The evening had started so beautifully, but ended with me being locked alone in my aunt's guest room, reading a list that made me doubt her sanity and my own. If you smell fire, get away as quickly as possible. They will burn you. Do not trust the animals here. Iron angers them. The fog isn't always present. When it is, don't trust your mind. If it storms, go inside as quickly as possible. Never stare into the well. They will pull you in. I'm not easily frightened, and although it was strange, I didn't find the list too disturbing until I got to the last warning. If you see me staring at you at night, run away. Fortunately, I wasn't stared at on the first night. By morning, I had almost forgotten all the strange things. My aunt had left for work early, and I decided to grab some donuts at the local bakery. The fog was barely noticeable that morning, but the foul sulfur smell was still present. It became even more intense as I entered the bakery, instantly suppressing my hunger. But the lady behind the counter was already smiling at me, showing her large teeth. It smelled like she had burned the bread all morning. "What can I get for you, sweetie?" I looked at the pastries, but every single one was moldy, green and blue with a fuzzy film. Actually, I'm not hungry. I just wanted to see..." Her smile vanished. "I bake every single day. What a disgusting tone is that? Who the hell are you anyway? Who brought you here?" She went into a rage, spitting with every word. Before I could step back, she grabbed my arm and pulled me closer. "You don't belong here. You're not rotten yet," she whispered. With her other hand, she grabbed a lighter and held a flame directly under my hand. Finally, I pulled my arm back. "Fight or flight," I heard a voice in my head, but flight won out. Outside, I checked my hand. There was no burn mark, and I felt no pain. Did I just hallucinate? My mind was so confused that I didn't even notice the fog had returned until after a minute or two. I turned back to the bakery once more, and when I saw the lady behind the glass front grinning, I started to run. Of course, there had to be a connection between the points on my aunt's list and this lady. My aunt lived in a cursed place. That was immediately clear to me. My mother never talked to me about demons, but I know they play an important role in our family. I used to think they were old-town superstitions and never really listened when an uncle or cousin talked about rituals or the like, but lately, my mind had been more active. Since I started experiencing some changes myself. The problem is, it's my father's side of the family that deals with such things, not my mother's. So I came to May because I thought I needed a break. But now I knew for sure that this place was cursed, and I began to wonder if I had walked into a trap. My nerves were shot. I should have run to the train station instead of my aunt's house, but I didn't. Something held me back. This place felt oppressive, but at the same time, it felt like I belonged here. These thoughts went through my mind as I fell into the comfortable bed in May's guest room. She wasn't home, so I couldn't talk to her yet. And eventually, exhaustion overcame me, and I fell asleep. When I woke up, it was already dark. I heard knocking on the door, then scratching. Then someone tried to open the door. May might have said something, but whoever it was didn't speak. It's okay. I've locked the door," I talked myself into, but the rattling only got louder. And finally, I heard the squeaking sound of the door opening. Sometimes, when you're scared, your eyes just won't open. They try to protect you from what's coming. This time was different. My eyes flew open wide, as if I had just woken up from a nightmare. But in reality, I had just fallen into one. My eyes met May's, although hers had nothing to do with the warm, almond-shaped eyes I remembered. Instead, they were upside down, like the socks folded into each other. "Chernobog," an unknown voice whispered from her mouth. I have no idea what this word means, but when I heard it, a shock ran through me. It felt like a million worms were being pulled apart in my mind. The creature, wearing my aunt's skin, dragged its feet across the floor and moved closer to my bed. Again, the voice in my head said, "Fight or flight," and this time it wanted to fight. But I remembered the words on the list. I should run. So I jumped out of bed before the creature could get any closer. A shiver running through my body as I passed it, especially when it tried to reach me with its fingers. I went to the door and slammed it shut behind me. I ran into the darkness of my aunt's house, tripping over tables and walls, but didn't stop until I finally stumbled into something soft that smelled of lavender and roses. "It's okay," whispered the familiar voice of my aunt. "That wasn't me. To be honest, I thought your uncle had sent you, but I found it too early to ask. I don't know how much you know about his business. The demon business or the demons, I wanted to ask. I had recently learned that my powerful uncle can access the underworld in more than one way. That was one of the reasons I wanted to leave home. Well, exhausted hosts come here," my aunt continued, "and your uncle sometimes sends those he can't control." We had all the lights in the house on. May made tea, and after a while, I slowly calmed down. The problem is, I don't know why I was so scared. I should have been used to these things by now. I had learned weeks ago that I was possessed by a creature myself. Not a hill spirit, but another kind of demon. One I had grown used to because it gave me strength and confidence. Here, it was somehow much weaker. "Exhausted?" I asked. She was silent for a moment. "Sometimes people get sick, old, or they die, but the demon that possesses them can continue to live. "So, everyone here is dead or dying, are you?" She shook her head. "I'm here because your uncle didn't want me near you, and your mother listens to what he says. But I've started to like it here. I have a purpose. I take care of the lost souls." She tried to smile, but her eyes looked sad and tired. Something inside me began to pulse, and I wondered if that was why my mother had sent me here. Does my family think I'm a lost soul? Are they trying to get rid of me? Also, Gut, let's make one thing clear. I don't believe in ghosts, I don't believe in the Easter Bunny, and I damn sure don't believe in any wooden creatures. At the gloomy edge of the Pacific Northwest forest, Jake Thompson cleared his throat. He waited until my father and I had stopped and stood directly across from him, then added, "But I have a team with thumbs firmly planted in their asses because there are fairy tale monsters roaming out here. So I have to play your stupid game." "Congratulations," my father said. "Mr. Thompson, I know you think I'm crazy or a fraud, probably both. But I'm telling you one last time, it's not too late to take a bath with the money you might lose and find another project." Our employer was a muscular man with an even complexion, dressed in a tracksuit and white sneakers. He wore a large Rolex that caught the moonlight every time he scratched his thick, useful neck. "Are you almost done?" "Yes, I am." "Good. Do you want to get paid tonight?" "That would be really nice." "Then shut your trap and do what I hired you for." "Fair enough," replied my father. He grabbed 2 flashlights from his backpack and threw one in my direction. I caught it, a lump already forming in my throat. A labyrinth of twisted, crooked trees lay before us, their skeletal branches clashing like swinging arms. I had never seen a wooden creature. I didn't yet know if I had the courage to face one. My biggest fear at the time was disappointing my old man. Father led us along natural clearings until after about a dozen steps into the forest interior, the foliage thinned out. Over his shoulder, he said, "So, tell me, Mr. Thompson, isn't Devil's Peak a National Heritage Site? I'm surprised you got permission to clear the land. Is that your way of solving the problem? Showing these tree beings that I have the right papers? I was just curious. You're not the first visitor to try and buy land cheaply." Our employer rolled his eyes. "Well, Klaus, the simple fact is that this new development will be the magnet that attracts opportunities. The managers are scared of environmental warriors whining on Facebook, sure, but they also know that everything I touch turns to gold. Didn't the conservation groups try to stop you?" "Of course they did. Luckily, I don't believe in no's." "Interesting. I could have sworn the judge said no to your appeal against the reclamation order. You had to give up, 19 apartments?" "These fraud allegations are as legitimate as your little wooden friends," hissed Jake, his voice bitter. As this outsider belittled our beliefs, I gritted my teeth. However, my father just laughed. The skeptic couldn't rattle him, not my father, steadfast as an oak, tall and lanky with a shock of gray hair and a long, straight nose just like mine. He said, "If you don't believe this nonsense, why are you coming to ask me for help?" "2 things. First, I came to ask for help. And second, I'm not an idiot. I've seen this fraud before. You locals invent fairy tales and shout about cultural heritage," air quotes accompanied these words, "to blackmail the evil entrepreneur from the big city. Well, fair warning. If I don't see any supernatural crap tonight, you won't get a single cent from me. Sound reasonable?" "It does, but fair warning, I strongly advise against any wooden creature touching you." "Oh dear, I'll try." Mr. Thompson looked down from his nose at me. "Ethan, right? How old are you, Ethan?" "I'm 12, I said. 12, huh? And that's old enough to hunt ghosts?" "Ethan can take care of himself," replied my father. my face flushed with pride over the compliment. Besides, there are things he needs to learn. The path twisted 3 times, leading us through muddy grass, along a narrow brook, deeper and deeper into the darkness. From the endless blackness, I could hear the crunching of dry leaves and the snapping of rotting wood pieces. Above the canopy where we could see it, the moon drifted behind thick, billowing clouds and reappeared. My electrified nerves twitched at every call of a tiny animal, barely audible beneath the whispering trees swaying in the wind. "Well?" said Mr. Thompson after a minute of silence. "Well, what?" asked my father. "Isn't this the part where you tell me about the tree fairies?" "I thought you don't believe in such things." "I don't. But I'm not just going to have my team show up tomorrow and say you didn't do the right magical tap dance to cleanse the evil spirits. What do you actually know about them?" "I know they're stopping me from streaming this damn hole." Father ducked under a branch. "Is that all? They kill children who wander through the woods late at night, blah, blah, blah. It's your standard town." Before Mr. Thompson could finish the sentence, a mouse scurried out from under a fallen log. He squeaked, hopped from one foot to the other, did a little foxtrot, and tried to kick the tiny animal, which was much too fast. Without turning around, my father said, "Don't worry. I've seen braver men here who jump out of their skin with fear." Despite the built-up fear, I laughed. My father enjoyed that. A lot. Mr. Thompson mumbled something too quietly to hear. "Well, the kid is partly right," my father said on the other side of a fern garden. "What they're actually doing is—" His voice trailed off there. "You know what? It's too creepy. We don't want Ethan to run away without evidence, do we, Ethan? Stop downplaying it and tell the damn story." The beam of my father's flashlight swept in low arcs across the ground. "Ethan, do you want to take this over?" All around us, the trees closed in from every direction. As we struggled forward, our cheeks and arms were scraped by sharp branches. It felt like the forest was constantly reaching for us, touching us. Almost against my will, I admired their resemblance to twisted, elongated shapes. Next to the developer, I cleared my throat. The wooden creatures are like us, or, well, some are. Others, not so much. Do you know what a doppelganger is? "No," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "A doppelganger is—" "He's kidding, Ethan," my father said as he fought through more tangled underbrush. Behind him lay a sea of leaves, smothered in darkness. I said, "Oh? So there's a colony of wooden people out here living in wooden villages. They used to keep away from us, and we kept away from them. People didn't worry about them. Like hurricanes. If you live somewhere with lots of hurricanes, you'd probably think about them. But in Oregon, we never had a hurricane because it's not a warm tropical climate, so we don't worry about them. It was the same with the wooden creatures. It was hard to encounter them. But then we started building cities and railways and so on. That meant their homes were constantly being destroyed, so they began to move. But then we started building even more, so through a narrow gap, I saw movement and hesitated. A cold gust of air scattered dead leaves over my boots. Mr. Thompson said, "Let me guess. Soon they had so little space that they got angry and attacked." Well, no. At first, they tried to explain their problem. "Oh, so our wooden friends speak English. They're like those talking trees in Game of Thrones, right?" He walked and stood next to a nearby birch, pressed his mouth against a large hollow in its knobby trunk and said, "Hey, tree friend, are you awake? Can I clear this place?" The entrepreneur looked at us, grinned, his porcelain white teeth clearly visible against the darkness. "Well, what do you know?" He said it was completely okay. In the middle of a patch of dirt, mud, and weeds, my father said, "Quiet, you two." Branches scratched roughly against each other as the forest trembled in its various joints. "What is it, a fox?" asked Mr. Thompson. Father silenced him with a gesture. From somewhere invisible, whispers echoed. Or maybe it was just the wind. My trembling hand struggled to hold the flashlight steady. Again and again, I wiped the sweat from my jacket and prayed that my father didn't notice. Father turned to us. "Ethan, you stay here with Mr. Thompson. I will—" "Oh no," countered the cynic. "If I stay here, you go out, smoke a cigarette, and come back out of breath as if you just performed an exorcism." Unable to hide his excitement, my father exhaled through his nostrils. "You asked for my help. Now I'm giving it to you. Nobody is trying to scam you, I promise. You don't live as part of nature, so you don't see it. But Oregon bleeds magic. The world does. And now it's starting to fight back. If there are wooden people in this forest tonight, you'll leave this forest as a changed person, believe me. But now I need you to listen." It was strange to see my father angry. He was usually so calm. To me, he said, "Ethan, I'm going to lure them out now. Stay here and keep a candle burning in case they come this way." From my backpack, I grabbed an Olympic torch and lit it with a lighter from the side pocket. The thought that Father wasn't there to protect us made my blood run cold. If the wooden creatures attacked, it would be up to me to protect us. My father said, "Remember, Mr. Thompson, no matter what happens, don't let them touch you." This warning was met with an eye roll. With the flashlight in hand, my father disappeared behind a group of ash trees while I stood there, knees trembling. "The problem with you small-town folks," said Jake, as soon as the darkness fully swallowed my father. "All this superstition. This development could be a great opportunity, more tax revenue, more jobs. But instead, you run around and fear things that make noises at night. Those aren't superstitions," I snapped back, more energetically than intended. "And besides, even if they were, there are animals here too. Are we just going to destroy their homes so you can make money? Kid, do you see that?" He tapped his Rolex. "This baby cost $50,000. The BMW I arrived in was 3 times that. Your dad drives a hatchback older than you. I heard that junker sputters up the road 5 minutes before you showed up. Here's a free piece of advice. If you want to make something of your life, get your head out of the clouds." A black spot briefly filled the gaps between the trees at the corner of my eye. After getting irritated again, I said, "Money isn't everything. Sorry to burst your bubble, kid, but it is. Why else would your old man be out here? If he was really keen on protecting the forest, why would he take my money to perform this bogus cleansing?" I had no answer, so I turned around instead. Another cold gust of wind made me shiver. A moment later, I heard the rustling of dead leaves. I swallowed a weak, "Dad?" No answer. "Is this the part where you stage an attack?" Mr. Thompson asked, pretending to be bored. But did his voice tremble a bit? Branches moved as the forest took deep, trembling breaths. It sounded like whispering. My heart rate accelerated. It's a nice trick, I have to admit. Tom did a terrible job sounding uninterested. More whispering now behind us. I prayed silently that Father would come back and then turned my torch and flashlight around. Illuminated by the beam of light stood a massive, tumor-like oak tree. Behind it came the rapid sound of footsteps. I held the torch like a shield. "Who's there?" My companion hovered like a shadow over me, so close that his short, quick breaths blew down my neck. What happened to all his courage, barely visible with the light? The tree inhaled and exhaled. I stood completely still, weapon raised and trembling. "See?" stammered Mr. Thompson. "It's nothing. Just the wind." Before he could finish the sentence, a pair of eyes opened. cloudy and pale as if plagued by gray clouds. Pressed against the tree, a face looked back at us, like a mask of living bark, and smiled. Together, Mr. Thompson and I screamed. My hands slipped with the torch, which slid into a mud patch and went out with a wet splash. The forest broke into babbling and whispering. Behind us, ahead, on both sides. I threw the flashlight in one direction and then the other. Every time the beam hit a tree, another face appeared, each grinning like a group of Cheshire cats. In unison, figures stepped away from the trunks. From head to toe, they had the rough texture of bark, except for the pale eyes. Malevolent growths enveloped their skulls, branches and limbs sprouted from their shoulders and necks, and some were even covered with fuzzy moss. Limping with rough joints bent at strange angles, they trudged toward us. A screaming Mr. Thompson tore himself through a narrow gap in the underbrush. I ran after him, unable to think straight. Hip-high foliage pressed in on both sides of the path to our ankles. I followed the sturdy man through a maze of sticks and spears as he sprinted ahead, faster than my legs could carry me. Out of nowhere, he came to an abrupt stop. As I caught up, the terrified man stepped back from more wooden beings, too many to count. He turned on his heels, pushing me aside with his heels, only to discover Morse approaching behind us, cutting off every escape route. Jake sniffled weakly. "Please, leave me alone. I'll give you anything, money, jewelry." He removed his Rolex and offered it as a gift. "I'll never come here again. Please, just..." Together, they stepped forward, limbs extended. They were now so close, so very close. As Jake stepped his foot into a bare root, he stumbled backward into the ground. All our tormentors stopped, except one that continued until it was close enough to stretch a limb against Jake's forehead. On hands and knees, it turned away, crawling over the tangled ground toward me. His face had already developed warts. No, not warts, suckers, buds. The flesh of his cheeks and forehead bubbled, swelling rapidly in sections, while dark spots spread ever darker on his neck, his forearms, his eyes, and even his lips. Paralyzed with fear, I could only watch. Tears streamed down the sleeves of his tracksuit, running over his shoulders, chest, and waistband. In seconds, Jake's limbs swelled and elongated. His clothing fell to the ground in torn ruins. Naked and disfigured, he stumbled to his feet and lumbered toward me, his screams fading, his limbs stiff and awkward. Roots sprouted from his feet and gripped the ground, biting deep, destroying any hope of moving forward. Through immovable lips, he stammered, "Help me, please." In his mouth, I saw a thick green carpet. Within seconds, the man was no longer distinguishable from a small oak tree, a branch stretching forward forever, the limb lying just a few centimeters from my neck. What snapped me out of my trance was the sound of vomiting. Behind the tree that was once Jake, the wooden creature gagged up splinters and moss. Its bark peeled away, revealing beige skin underneath. At the end of a limb, a fist opened and closed, tearing chunks of wood from a skull. Beneath these sections lay human features, nose, ears, lips. The man bent over, screamed, and gasped for air, like a chick hatching from its egg. I was so mesmerized by this disgusting sight that I didn't notice the other wooden beings surrounding us. After 6 frozen backward steps, a low branch, thicker than an amputated forearm, stabbed into the lower back area. I turned around, my heart fighting against my chest, only to discover that I had crashed into the nearest wooden person. I fell to the ground, my head buried in my lap. "Please," I whimpered. "I don't want to be one of you, please." Even then, my thoughts were with my father and what he might have thought when he saw his son lying there so frightened. A silence settled over the forest. I took several short, trembling breaths. That meant my lungs weren't solid yet. Not yet. Slowly, I looked up. Woody figures loomed above me, motionless. The nearest one pulled its limb back. "Let me through." My father's voice rang out from the crowd. "Dad?" I called. Figures stepped aside, clearing a path through which he walked. "Ethan." I stood up, ran forward, and threw myself into his arms, my cheeks wet with tears. I dropped the torch. "I'm sorry, I'm so... Shh, it's okay." He placed a warm hand on my shoulder and my nerves calmed down. "But Mr. Thompson, he's completely fine." Father stepped aside. Behind his shoulder, a new Mr. Thompson donned a replacement outfit from my father's backpack. A dry gulp paralyzed my throat. "We need to run. It's okay, we're not in any danger." He pulled me close to him. "You see, my son, there's something you need to know about us. How I know so much about this place. You and I, Ethan, we were among the first. Years ago, before you were old enough to even remember, our people realized that we needed a way to protect ourselves. So I volunteered to talk to the humans. But they didn't want to listen, so now we resist, against those who want to destroy our home. We are wooden people. We sinned. We are wooden people?" Father squeezed my hand. "But what'll happen to Mr. Thompson?" "But what happens to Mr. Thompson?" He gestured to the tree that was once the real estate mogul. Every wanderer who stumbled upon it might have made a casual remark about the vague human shape, the distorted part of the branches, vaguely shaped like a screaming face, forever etched in terror. You could practically hear the silent scream. Jake Thompson, the new Jake Thompson, lifted the discarded Rolex from the mud and brushed it clean. He gave me a small smile and then slipped the watch onto his wrist. I squeezed my father's hand even tighter. "But couldn't we have helped him? We could have explained." He shook his head. "If we turn 100 Jake Thompsons, 100 more would just appear. We have to replace them, my son, all of them, the humans. Like I said, Oregon bleeds magic, and these flesh sacks never learn. So we take over, not just here but everywhere, England, Germany, Spain, America." He knelt down, bringing himself to eye level with me. "Are you ready, my son? Will you help us protect this world?" I wiped the tears from my eyes, a new hardness in my stomach. "I will, Dad. I will." My name is Michael Miller. I'm writing this as a step-by-step recounting of the cold winter night I spent in the remote regions of the Pacific Northwest. Some of the things I'm about to tell you may seem illogical or hard to believe. I simply ask that you patiently follow me as I guide you through every second of my adventure. My journey began on February 6, 2018. I am a police officer here in one of the smallest and most peaceful towns in Oregon. I will omit the exact names of places so that no one attempts to trace my steps. On that late Thursday evening, I finished my shift and made the decision to embark on a long hike over the weekend to find a secluded spot deep in the forest to camp. This week had been particularly stressful. Officers John Smith and Lucas Weber were transferred to another department, so I, along with the other 4 patrol officers, had to pick up their hours here. Overtime is overtime, yes, but lack of sleep and dealing with the quirks of rural America can wear down even the strongest minds. On Friday morning, I woke up around 6:15 a.m. and began brewing coffee with my coffee maker while heading to the bathroom. I grabbed my cup and went down to the basement to retrieve my hiking and camping gear from the dry storage rooms. The first thing I grabbed was my Osprey Ether AG70 hiking backpack. The gear is massive but super lightweight and holds everything I need, except for my A-Alps Mountaineering Tasmanian 3 tent which attaches to the bottom of the backpack. I secured the tent to the backpack and then reached for my Keen hiking boots as well as the necessary items like my Nemo Disco 30 sleeping bag, a small pot for hot water, a pack of Safety Chem glow sticks, a TACMED Patrol Trauma Response First Aid Kit, 2 Duracell headlamps, spare batteries, of course, water purification tablets, a Nalgene 1-liter water bottle, and my rechargeable phone charger. After gathering everything necessary from the basement, I brought it all to the living room and placed it on the corner sofa. I went to the bedroom to grab spare clothes for the next day and an extra beanie hat in case something happened to my main hat. Back in the living room, I began neatly packing everything into my backpack when my phone rang. It was my colleague and good friend Stefan, who warned me about a cold snap that was expected to hit later in the afternoon. I wondered if I should still go, but he just said it was my decision. I thanked him, hung up, and continued packing. I grabbed 6 MRE packs from the kitchen and stuffed them along with a few Snickers bars for a little reward into my backpack. I took 4 Hot Pockets from the freezer, heated them up, and ate them as quickly as possible to save time. By the time I finished packing, it was 7:10 a.m. I took a shower and washed up with a deodorizing soap so that predators couldn't easily detect my scent. In case you haven't noticed, I'm a big hiking nerd. I don't buy cheap stuff when it comes to my gear and essentials. I only buy the best of the best for my safety. After the shower, I packed my toiletries into my backpack and got dressed in the bedroom. In case you're interested, I was wearing black Patagonia Quandary pants, a heather gray The North Face fleece hoodie, a black Marmot Phoenix jacket, and a light gray Patagonia Fisherman's Fold beanie. I know it's a lot of detail, but I want you to really feel everything I felt all the time and prove that I vividly remember the finest details of the worst day of my life. I took all my stuff to the garage and placed everything on the hitch of my VW transporter. I checked everything to make sure I hadn't forgotten anything. I opened my gun cabinet and grabbed my SIG P320 service pistol and my OWB duty holster. I always keep a full magazine in my sidearm, so I thought I'd bring a box of 30 rounds in case I wanted some fun. I strapped everything down, loaded my backpack onto the back seat of the transporter, and set off into nowhere. The mood outside and the drive to the trailhead were somewhat unsettling. It's hard to describe the feeling I had while driving in the dark, as if someone in the back seat was intensely staring at me. I am a 6 feet 3 inches, 230-pound man who doesn't scare easily, but I was terrified. It was 7:45 a.m. on a Friday, and I only passed by one other person. Normally, traffic at this time would be moderate, but it seemed like everyone had left town or were still in their houses sleeping. I turned on my car radio and connected my phone to listen to some metal to pump myself up, but for some reason, it only increased my anxiety tenfold. I had just passed the last traffic light of the town and drove into the well-lit underground tunnel. Not 3 seconds after entering the tunnel, I had to brake immediately, thanks to the stupid dog that suddenly jumped onto the road in front of me. I'm not exaggerating. That dog literally came out of nowhere. The tunnel has a 2-way street with solid concrete walls on both sides, only about 5 feet from the road, so I would have seen the dog at the roadside if it had been there. It was almost as if the animal had run out of the wall and jumped directly in front of my transporter. It happened so fast, and my adrenaline shot through the roof as I saw the dog, so I didn't feel or hear anything as I hit it. At least, that's what I thought. I pulled over to the roadside to inspect the damage, but to my surprise, there was nothing on the ground behind the transporter and no signs of damage to the front of my vehicle. I looked in both directions of the tunnel and saw no silhouette of anything, just the entrance and exit of the tunnel. I was completely freaked out. Something like this had never happened to me before. I never believed in the paranormal until that moment. I got back into my transporter and drove out of the tunnel. I didn't want this incident to ruin my entire weekend, so I stayed strong and continued towards the trailhead. Don't get me wrong, I was still scared. The rest of the way to the trailhead was uneventful, and I didn't pass by another vehicle at all. I knew something was off about my morning, but I was stubborn and didn't want anything to ruin my weekend. The trailhead was deserted. It was still dark outside, but the faint orange lights were on, and I could see the pitch-black opening between the trees. That was the hiking trail. I parked on the right side of the trail and turned off the transporter. I sat there for at least a minute, staring into the pitch-black opening. The silence was eerie. All I could hear were various ringing tones in my own head. I looked at the temperature gauge, and it showed -5 degrees Celsius. I sighed a little, got out of the transporter, yawned deeply, and stretched up to the sky, then reached for my jacket on the passenger seat. I took the backpack out and placed it on the hitch to grab a headlamp, but as soon as I placed the lamp over my hat, I heard a noise that sounded like a sneeze. I couldn't tell who or what it came from, if it was even a sneeze, but it had that distinct hiss-hush sound. I stopped abruptly and scanned the parking lot, but I couldn't see anything. As a police officer for 13 years, I know when something evil is watching me, and that's exactly how I felt at that moment. I ignored it, turned on my lamp, strapped my backpack back on, and headed down the trail. I turned around once more to look at the parking lot, but saw no one. I dismissed it all as a possible animal in the woods and continued down the path. I hiked for about 20 minutes until the sun finally rose over the Oregon forest. I could see the frost glittering on everything. It was beautiful. The morning birds were singing their routine songs, and I felt safer because there was still life around me. I came to a small bridge crossing a little brook about 3 miles up the trail. I stopped, took a break, and drank some water, then heard that sneeze noise again. This time, it sounded like it was coming a little way back, where I had just come from. My heart began to beat faster and faster. For some reason, I remembered the dog and thought maybe it had followed me all the way, but that was impossible. I drove the entire distance at 50 miles per hour because there was no traffic. I got tired of worrying about it, so I said, "Hey, is someone down there?" But got no answer. I felt strange, but I knew I could handle myself, so I kept walking up the trail. I came to a fork in the path, and one of the ways looked like people used it daily, while the other was overgrown with tall yellow grass, making it hard to see that it was even a path. I knew I wanted to be left alone by others, so I took the grassy path. The trail was so overgrown that I didn't notice the frozen puddles under my feet and learned the hard way. My left leg slipped off the edge of the trail onto the steep slope into the ravine. Instinctively, I grabbed the nearest thing to avoid falling, but the only thing I could grab was the jagged, icy edge of the path, which tore my index finger wide open. I rolled into the ravine and landed flat on my stomach. Physically, I was unable to get up for about 10 seconds. I must have been unconscious, but I could still see the ground where my face was lying. I sat up and immediately looked at my finger, and that's when the pain set in. I took off my backpack and grabbed the trauma kit. I cleaned the wound with alcohol and wrapped it tightly with gauze and medical tape. At this point, I was angry and screamed, "Damn it," at the top of my lungs. After doing that, I saw movement out of the corner of my eye and looked up the trail to see nothing. I put the first aid kit back in the backpack, packed it on my back, and marched up the slope to get back on the trail. It wasn't until I was back on the trail that I noticed the tall, dead yellow grass was still covering the path down. There were also no icy patches anymore, just gravel and dirt. I was confused for a moment and thought I had landed next to another path, but there was a trail sign I had seen before my fall, and it was only a few meters away from me. I was confused, but continued my way a bit further. I came to the steep part of the trail and, to my surprise, saw a large open lake. I didn't know there was a lake in this part of the Oregon forest, but there it was. It was crystal clear. I remember the elegant blue shimmer it had, with occasional ice patches on top, but the entire area was dead silent. No wind, no birds, just silence. There was no path on either side of the lake. The path I was on ended right beneath my feet. I scanned the area further, and above the tree line on my right side, saw something that looked like a large cross in the distance. I never expected that in the middle of nowhere, let alone in the woods. I walked towards the tree line, and as I took about 6 steps towards it, I heard the hiss-hush noise directly behind me. I felt my knees give slightly with fear, but I steadied myself and turned around to see something pale at the edge of the lake. I slowly approached it while turning around to see if I could find what was causing the noise, but then a smell hit me. I felt my throat tighten and my stomach grow heavy. Then, as I reached the water, I realized that the pale thing I saw was the head of a woman. I couldn't even move. I didn't make a sound. I just stared. The left side of her head was sticking out of the water and had no flesh or tissue, just a pale white skull. The top of her head had short white hair with dark red tones. I didn't want to touch the head to see what the other side looked like. I simply turned around and gagged from the smell. I wiped my mouth with my hand, then heard a bloody scream from the same direction where I had seen the cross. I began to sprint through the trees toward the cross. I reached the other side of the tree line and saw a large field. On the other side of the field stood a large church with a wooden cross on top. I jogged to the church and began calling out, "Help is on the way. I need to know where you are." Zrania, but I got no response. Halfway through the field, I tripped over something hard. I sat down and saw that I had tripped over a goat's skull. My first thought was that maybe people live up here and have a small farm. I stood up and ran to the church. There was a wooden fence about 3 feet high around the perimeter, and I jumped over it. The wood of the church looked almost ancient and rotted. It had obviously been there for a very long time. I called out again, "Hello," and got nothing. I leaned against the fence to inspect my knee. I had pretty badly injured it when I tripped over the skull, but before I could pull up my pant leg, I heard a faint chanting coming from the church. My heart stopped. I stood there dead still. I couldn't understand what they were saying, but it sounded like Latin or maybe Spanish, but all I could hear was Estacinem talk. They repeated this over and over, and it sounded like many people were there. I looked between the beams of the church walls to peek inside, but there was no one. No light, nothing. Just old pews and light shining through the cracks in the walls. The chanting stopped as I looked into the building. Everything became silent again. As I stared into the church, I saw something black out of the corner of my right side. I jerked my head around to see what looked like the lower end of a robe passing by the corner of the building. I ran over to peek around the corner, but saw no one. At the front of the church were carvings. They looked like pentagrams with some sort of skull in the center. I knew immediately that I was in a very bad place. I noticed the same thing out of the corner of my eye and saw whatever it was passing behind the other side of the building. I called out, "Who are you?" "My name is Officer Miller. Come out and talk to me." I approached the corner of the building and heard a swirling noise behind me, followed by an axe flying past my head. I turned around and saw 2 men in black robes approaching me, both holding improvised knives made of rusty metal. I drew my SIG from the holster and aimed my laser at the man on the left. I shouted, "Drop your weapons or I'll use deadly force." They continued walking toward me, about 150 feet away. The man on the left threw his knife at me and I luckily dodged it by ducking to the right. I stood up and yelled, "Last chance, drop those damn weapons!" They both started running toward me. I fired a bullet into the head of the man on the right. The man on the left stopped and stared at the lifeless man on the ground, then looked toward the church and called out something that sounded like "Ma tra ke lo." Then I heard the chanting I had heard earlier, only this time loud. The man looked at me, and as we locked eyes, men and women in robes came out of the church, loudly chanting. None of them had weapons, but they were all tall, very tall, somewhere between 9 feet and 10 feet. All of them walked slowly, heads bowed. The man turned around and disappeared into the crowd of giants. I began to walk backwards in shock, not knowing what to do. One of the conspicuously large ones in front of the crowd let out a bloody scream that shook my ears. Then I raised my weapon and shot him in the leg. I say him because I couldn't tell if he was male or female due to the massive scars on his face. He fell to his knees and let out a whimper. Then they all paused and stared at me. All of them had their faces somehow mutilated. Some of them didn't even have eyes, but they still stared directly at me. At this point, my adrenaline was so high that I felt my heart beating in my arms and legs. The woman got back on her feet, pointed at me, and quietly repeated, "Ma tra ke lo." And at that very moment, I felt and heard a breath on my neck. I turned around to see what looked like a large, stocky man without a jaw staring at me. He was completely naked and had ugly cut wounds all over his body. His tongue hung limply from his mouth as he breathed hoarsely through his saliva. He let out a slight chuckle, followed by the hiss-hush sound I had heard before, then grabbed me by the backpack strap and slammed me to the ground. The people in robes began to cheer as the creature screamed towards the sky and pounded his chest with his right hand. He looked down at me and glared at me. I tried to scream in pain, but I had no breath, and my chest hurt. I unzipped my backpack and slipped it off. The creature lifted his right foot over me and began to scream. I rolled away from him as he tried to stomp his foot on the ground. He let out an angry scream, then the people began to scream furiously. I got up and ran along a brick path away from the church. I could hear the heavy steps of the axeless creature close behind me, and the screams of the people became wilder and almost guttural. I ran between 2 burning torches along the path, one on each side, and the screaming stopped, and I couldn't hear the creature's steps anymore. I turned around and saw that they were all standing on the other side of the torches. I stood there, panting and trying to catch my breath. An old, weathered man at the edge of the crowd stared at me and spoke both in Spanish and German. "Casa de Diablo, you are now one of them." They all slowly turned around and walked silently up the brick path. It got dark outside, even though it should still be morning. I looked around to figure out where I was. To my right stood a small shed. Directly down the brick path, a collapsed barn, and next to the barn, an old cabin. I bent down and placed my hands on my knees to think about how to get out of here. I muttered, "My damn backpack. Everything I need to survive is in this backpack." I realized I had to go back to the church to grab my backpack, but that wouldn't be easy if those beings were still up there. I stood up and turned around to the path to the church to see a black dog between the 2 torches. I immediately recognized the dog that had run away from my transporter that morning. The dog let out a deep growl as the skin on its face looked very loose, almost as if it was melting. The deep growl turned into a loud half-whine, half-roar, almost like a lion's roar or a big cat's roar. I turned around and began sprinting toward the shed next to the barn. The dog growled briefly behind me. The door to the shed was wide open, so I ran inside and slammed the door shut immediately. I leaned against the door and waited for the dog to try to push it open, but there was no sound from outside. I stood there and took a deep breath as a foul flesh odor filled my nose. My throat tightened again, and I felt unwell. I heard something that sounded like a hungry stomach gurgling somewhere back in the shed, but it was loud. Hesitantly, I looked to the left and saw a creature slowly rising from the ground. There was little to no light in the shed, only light from outside shining through the cracks in the walls. I could make out the shape of a large but thin figure in the main room in front of me. Then it made a leaking sound, like a dog licking peanut butter off its palate. After that, it let out a brutal, guttural scream mixed with the pain of a woman in pure agony and ran toward me. As it revealed itself in the light, I could see that it was indeed large, but it had the head of a black goat and the legs of a horse, which were, however, bent backward and thinner. I moved to draw my weapon, but the creature was too fast. It sprinted toward me, rammed its head directly into my chest, and threw me 6 feet into a wall. My weapon fell out of my hand and slid about 3 feet away from me, so I rolled toward it, but the creature managed to kick my left hand. I screamed in pain and curled into a ball as the creature continued to scream and stomp around me. I looked up and saw it staring at the ceiling, with a protruding tongue and drooling mouth. I jumped to my feet, grabbed the weapon from the ground, and aimed the laser at the creature's neck. My adrenaline was so high that my hands were shaking violently. As I tried to pull the trigger, I shot off its left horn. It tore the head toward me and let out one of the screams, then lowered its head to ram me again. I dodged and landed sideways, with the laser directly aimed at its neck. I pressed the trigger and saw the creature fall flat to the ground. Its breathing was angry, and the sounds it made with every breath sounded like gurgling because of the blood. It lay flat on the ground like a fish out of water as I ran out of the shed. I came outside and looked for an escape route. The giant people walked down the path from the church, chanting loudly, and the dog was nowhere to be seen. I looked back into the shed and saw that the goat creature was still gurgling but trying to stand up. As I looked at the shed, I saw a path leading behind it. I ran that path, and at the end, I could see 2 more torches and a path leading into a cave. The path was long, and a cave was the last place I wanted to go, but it was my only option. As I sprinted down the way, I noticed that along the path were spike posts with heads of young women and various organs hanging from them. I ran into the cave and only went about 10 feet inside before I realized that I had no light and the cave was pitch dark. The giant beings knew I was there and that I was trapped. They rolled a boulder in front of the entrance, leaving me in absolute darkness and all alone. I fell to my knees and then to my butt and began to cry. Not sobbing, but crying, knowing that I would die this way. I began to hear the echo of heavy breathing from deep within the cave. It sounded like whatever it was had completely stopped breathing. The echoes grew louder and louder with each second. Then I began to feel vibrations on the ground from loud thuds hitting the floor almost like horse hooves, but heavier, if that makes sense, and there was more than one set. Almost like warriors marching into battle. The echoes transformed into the same guttural screams the creature in the shed made, but they came from all directions. The sounds eventually reached every side of me, then my feet were being pulled out from underneath me. I felt hooves slamming against every part of my body. I heard my own bones cracking, louder than all other sounds in the cave. I felt the flesh of my stomach being ripped apart by the fingers of these creatures. They opened my chest and plucked my organs out, letting them fall into my face piece by piece. I lay there in total agony as these beings literally tore me apart. I remember thinking, how am I still conscious? My entire body eventually went numb. Shortly after, I heard one of the beings let out an ugly, gurgling scream and stomped on my head. I felt my skull being crushed under the weight of the being. Then I felt nothing anymore. I heard nothing. I felt absolutely nothing anymore, almost as if I had slept. Suddenly, I could open my eyes. All I could see was a bright, blurry light. Then my vision returned, and I saw that I was lying face down on the ground. I couldn't move, but I knew I was no longer in the cave. I had regained mobility, so I painfully sat up and looked around. I was back in the ravine I had fallen into at the start of my journey. I looked at my hand, and my finger was neither torn nor showed any signs of ever being cut. My body was not torn apart, and my left hand was not stomped by that damn monster. I felt my shoulders to make sure I still had the backpack straps. I felt my head to ensure I wasn't bleeding, but I was completely fine. I only had a headache. I began to cry as I climbed up the slope, believing that I was in an endless loop visiting hell. But as I reached the trail, the tall, dead yellow grass was still covering the way down. I could see the torn grass from where I had fallen and rolled down the slope. I began to cry harder as I returned to the main trail. Joggers and people walking their dogs passed by and gave me strange looks. No one said anything, but they stared at me out of fear or shock. I couldn't look anyone in the eyes. I just stared straight ahead and walked back to my transporter. I placed my backpack on the back seat and headed home. Traffic was back to normal, and people were on their way, living normal lives. I got home and brought my backpack to the basement, simply threw it on the floor, and walked upstairs like a zombie. I sat on the sofa and saw my phone lying on the coffee table. I had accidentally left it there, and the battery was dead. I turned on the TV and switched the channel to the news networks. I almost collapsed. It was Friday, February 14th, exactly 1 week after I started my camping trip. I had been away for a week, but all I could remember was the night I spent in that God-forsaken village. The next day, I had to talk to a few investigators from the police station and tell them about my disappearance and the experiences. One of them didn't believe a word I said, but the other had a curious face the whole time I spoke, but then tried to rationalize the situation. Then they told me that, to keep my job, I had to see a therapist twice a month and go through their investigations to determine if I was mentally ill or if what I told them was actually true. I had to go through their nonsense for days, but all my psychological evaluations came back clean, and every lie detector test proved I wasn't lying. I'm back at my job and living my life as normally as possible. I can't help but constantly wonder who the people in the cult were. What were the beings I saw? Did I really just dream it all and sleep through a whole week in the freezing cold? I don't know. I'll never find out, and the world will never understand the things I went through. I just ask you to try. If there was one thing Nick and Darren were always passionate about, it was hiking. No matter how dreadful our day jobs made us feel, an extended trek up a mountain always left us mentally clearer. From the summit, looking down on everything seemed so tiny that our problems barely mattered in the grand scheme of things. The Appalachian Mountains, the densely forested mountain range stretching through Tennessee, North Carolina, and Virginia, were our favorite hiking area. Whether it was Mount Mitchell, Clingman's Dome, or the rugged trails of the Great Smoky Mountains, we had likely explored them all. Despite the plethora of options, there was one issue that particularly annoyed Darren. These trails were always overcrowded. I don't consider myself anti-social, but Darren had a point. It became genuinely frustrating when you wanted to quietly enjoy your surroundings and slow your pace, only to be overtaken by a large group of breathless hikers, followed by another group of slower, louder hikers trailing behind. It felt more like a bustling shopping mall pedestrian zone than a serene mountain path. While the crowd did provide a sense of safety, no wild animals approached the commotion. Hiking simply became chaotic. We were at Nick's house in Asheville, enjoying a few beers Darren had brought from the Wildflower Brewery in Portland. Darren had only moved to Portland last year, while Nick and I had spent our entire lives hiking around the Appalachians. Darren frequently visited his parents in Knoxville. I hadn't heard much about the city, aside from its vibrant music scene. Still, they brewed some damn good beer. After we had downed most of the alcohol, Nick proposed a solution to our hiking dilemma. His suggestion? A hike to an old settlement that wasn't marked on any maps. It had never been completed. No matter how many people worked on it, nothing ever materialized, and people never returned. Allegedly, it was located in a remote part of the Appalachian Mountains, allowing us to experience the hike feeling we had always cherished. There were small rumors that this place still existed, according to locals in our neighboring region. He insisted that we go off the beaten path and search for it, as he had some clues from what he called unconventional journalism. I was always skeptical whether he meant the dark web or something else. Nick still dreamed of making it big in local journalism by presenting a story that would shock the people in our town. I, with my big dreams in landscape photography, wanted little to do with abandoned or otherwise disturbing scenes. I wanted to take photos of beautiful landscapes and sell them. So far, that hadn't made a fortune, and I was slowly falling apart. I had a dream and wanted money and recognition. We all had plenty of free time, having booked vacation days in case we wanted to do something. Nick wanted 2 weeks for this trip, which would take up most of my vacation days, and I wanted about 3 days. We compromised and decided that the hike would last a week. If we reached our destination sooner, we would leave earlier. Nick was by far the boldest of the three of us, and I was the most reserved. Nick told me to stop worrying and assured me that we would pack and prepare accordingly. I knew we would be camping overnight, and that made me uneasy. Darren helped Nick find access to this so-called unnamed settlement on the map, and it didn't take long. They had their eyes set on a secluded part of the Appalachians. According to Nick's research, the settlement would be near the mountains, if not directly on them. It was far, probably farther than we had ever hiked before. We would cross into North Carolina and park near the Smith River. We would follow the river until we found a nearby mountain and then hike up it. It was close to the border with Virginia, so the population would likely be minimal at worst and empty at best. It would just be the three of us searching for something strange in the middle of nowhere, without anyone bothering us. I made a list of all the gear I deemed necessary. Nick insisted that I bring my camera since its specifications were higher than his. Darren reminded me to take his sturdy GPS device, as we weren't consulting a hiking website to find a trail and might want to mark interesting spots. The mountains didn't seem steep enough to require climbing gear, but I wrote it down anyway. I also packed an axe and some bear spray. The two slowly convinced me, plus I trusted them. Nick and Darren had been scouts and had plenty of experience camping deep in the woods. I loved hiking, but I was also very afraid of things like bears and lynxes or anything unknown that you might encounter far off a trail. And what we ultimately found would confirm my fears. On the morning of the hike, we all piled into Nick's spacious SUV and drove northwest for a little over 8 hours. I helped Nick by taking the wheel for the last 2 hours so he could relax. The sun was almost completely set when we reached Smith River. A parking lot greeted us, and there was a worn-down lodge right by the riverbank. We bought some extra snacks and smaller necessities for the trip there. Nick asked the older man running the lodge if he had seen or heard anything about the unnamed settlement we were searching for. The older man looked confused. Nick tried to ask more questions, but the lodge owner became irritated and sent us away. Across the street was an entrance to a nature park, but I saw no one going in or out. Overall, there were only 2 cars in the entire parking lot. and I counted a lone car passing by the lodge on the highway. We decided to take a shortcut west of the river, as it would likely be a long journey to reach the next mountain. The next mountain seemed at least a small hike on its own, maybe 4 hours. We began the trek with the last hours of sunlight lighting our way. The area itself was beautiful, as is typical in the Appalachians. Long, deep green grassy strips stretched for miles, and the forest edge was dense with cedar and pine growth. It felt much more like Virginia. On the other side of the river, I noticed construction machinery just beyond the forest edge. None of them were moving, and by the sounds, they didn't seem to be operational. I assumed they were empty, to our relief. We saw some animals, namely a few raccoons and deer. I was pretty sure I also saw a moose. Nothing that made me uneasy. The fact that these animals were calmly wandering around gave me some relief. They probably wouldn't stay if predators were nearby, right? After about 2 hours of hiking, we decided to set up camp. Our tent was large, as it was meant for 8 people. With the help of a campfire for lighting, we set up the tent in minutes. The river was peaceful and soothing to listen to, as were the birds and the chirping insects. We grabbed a drink, ate some snacks, and decided to call it a night. I noticed a truck parked behind a few trees on the other side of the shallow river. That truck was alone, and from what I could see, it seemed to have been there for a few days. It was strange that they were so out here. Their construction machinery didn't follow them. Were construction workers building something, or looking for something? I hoped that construction workers wouldn't kick us out in the morning. Fortunately, Nick wasn't snoring, so I fell asleep pretty quickly. But when I woke up around 3 a.m., I noticed that Darren was awake and looking alert. I sneaked past Nick and asked Darren what was up. He said he could hear footsteps outside the tent. I decided to listen with him. There was hardly any chirping from insects and birds anymore. It was as if most had fled something nearby. A few minutes later, I also heard the footsteps. They were quick, like someone sprinting in short bursts. It sounded like 2 people, right outside the forest edge on our riverside. I heard a little giggling from one of the individuals, if I could call them that, outside. I was scared, just like Darren, but he tried to rationalize that maybe they were construction workers, given the equipment on the other side. Luckily for us, after hearing the sounds wandering about 50 meters away, they ran back into the trees about 10 minutes later. That didn't sound like normal people, and I would prefer normal people over those things any day. Darren and I didn't get much sleep that night. In the morning, we told Nick about it. He was surprised, even happy. We had explored around our tent and left it, and he was pleased about it. He insisted that we were on the right path and that if people were coming out of the forest, they must be members of that settlement. Darren argued that Nick should be cautious, as he remembered the sounds these beings made. It was too strange to be human. That intrigued Nick even more. We knew we couldn't sway him, but it felt dangerous or wrong to be out here. Sure, we had the numbers, but what did these beings have? Nick suggested that I take a look around our location and start our investigative hike into the forest. I knew I couldn't convince him otherwise, so I reluctantly agreed, and he and Darren took down the tent and packed for our tour while I scouted the area where I had heard the footsteps. Right from the start, something was off as I detected a smell that reeked of blood. My eyes darted quickly around the area. I was in search mode. I didn't want to draw attention in case something dangerous was nearby, so I stayed silent. I found my first clue when I discovered a name tag from what I thought was a forestry company. Carefully, I picked it up and noticed how dirty the tag was. It had bloodstains. Michael Cooper was the only readable part of the tag, aside from the tree trunk on the name tag. Right next to the name tag on the ground lay bloody, torn clothes that had been thrown at the trees. There were also several dry blood handprints on many of the trees, almost forming a pattern. Between the slender trees was a lot of space, and the deeper I looked into the trees, the darker it became, even on a clear morning. Whoever Michael Cooper was, I doubted he was still alive. It also didn't look like a good path to follow. I called the guys over and showed them my discovery. I had a dilemma in mind, considering what had happened the night before. Should we call the authorities and leave them to conduct a 2-hour hike in the middle of nowhere to probably search for a dead man? Or should we investigate ourselves to earn the title of great journalists, despite the danger? Part of me wanted neither, but would we be hailed as heroes or slandered if we ignored the whole thing for our investigation? As I pondered my dilemma, I noticed something that didn't look right on one of the trees. Carefully, I crept deeper into the forest, with Nick and Darren right behind me. I held my bear spray tightly. I heard a humming from the tree, almost like a vibration. From a distance, I could see that the tree had a different color and a very strange bump at the top. It almost looked like human arms were stretched out from the top. Something was also stinking. The smell got worse as we got closer. It smelled like someone had smeared it on the tree. The sound became clearer. Flies were buzzing around. Was it an animal carcass on a strange, red tree? As we got closer, I gained the clarity I needed, but I wished I hadn't. The branches of the tree were torn near the ground, and a mutilated body was bound in pieces to the tree with rough ropes. The severed head was distorted and resembled the name tag. It was Michael Cooper. This grotesque construction stood like a sort of sentinel in the forest. It looked like it was marking its territory. Nick and Darren, despite their love for bloody horror movies, looked just as disgusted as I did. A strong gut feeling told us to run for our lives. But what did that mean? This gruesome sight gave us a solution. Investigate a little, then leave, inform the authorities, and hope they would eliminate whatever it was that had done this. I took the GPS and marked our first camp. I thought we might need to fall back here in case things went south. It was a cozy spot, and nothing about what we planned was cozy. Then it was my task to mark the location of these murderers. The forest grew eerily quiet as the three of us packed our essentials, without the tent, and prepared for a quick trek deeper into this forest. I felt surprisingly secure with these two. They were both 5 years older than me, and had once again more experience. I was at the age where I wanted to stop being so cowardly, even against logic. Tracking a twisted murderer seemed like a damn good start. We didn't have firearms. The next thing we had in terms of weapons was bear spray and the axe I had brought, which was getting very dull. I thought it would work as a bludgeon. We still had plenty of snacks and a decent amount of drinks. We just wanted to plan for an hour, and I set a silent alarm to ensure that. We still had plenty of daylight, so we began our exploration. The breeze was soothing as we cautiously moved forward. It was also the only sound we heard. All small animals and insects had disappeared. Was there danger nearby? The three of us kept our eyes constantly moving to ensure we weren't making much noise as we advanced. I noticed the GPS batteries were getting weaker, so I planned to use it sparingly. I packed some tape that I used to discreetly mark trees, just in case. 10 minutes later, we found another one of those gruesome corpse sculptures. This one was much older, as much of the flesh had already decayed. It smelled terrible. Even Nick felt sick. He went into a nearby bush to vomit. We all somehow knew what we were getting into as we could smell it from afar. We were on the right track, at least. As I checked on Nick, I heard quickly cracking branches on the ground in the distance. Everyone ducked for cover as the sounds crossed our path ahead. They weren't too close, as I could tell, but this forest wasn't dense. Fortunately, the bushes on the ground were large enough to hide behind. Darren took cover behind a bush directly to my right, and Nick and I stayed under the same bush. I heard the familiar giggling from the night before, forcing me to stick my head out and take a look. About 100 meters ahead, I saw 3 naked individuals. Their movements were twitchy and fast, like spiders. They were hunched much more than the average person, looking unnatural. They slowed their pace and sniffed the air like animals. All had long hair, and from what I could see of their bodies, they were all female. Their heads were turned away, but one suddenly began to rotate in my direction. Holy shit! I quickly ducked back and prayed they didn't see me. I heard the giggling coming from all 3. I started trembling and refused to move. My heart began to race, as if I had run a marathon. Branches started to crack, but I couldn't tell if they were approaching me. My eyes darted around, and I kept looking to see if Darren saw them too. I signaled him to stay lower as I saw him move his body. Nick brilliantly decided to carefully bend some of the branches to form a peephole. I did the same. I heard grunting and other strange noises from these beings. As I looked through the shrubbery, I got a good view of one of these things. A naked humanoid woman, quite tall, was slowly shuffling through the area while the other 2 stayed back. The hair on her head was slimy and tangled. Her skin looked almost hard. Her face was distorted, with a near caveman appearance, and some of her teeth stuck out of her mouth, too long and curved to stay. She had dried bloodstains on her face and body. I quickly closed the hole I had made in the bushes and held the axe and bear spray firmly in each hand. I didn't want to be eaten today. I could now hear their steps, how they were cracking branches and moving gravel. A few more large steps, and they would be right in front of us. I handed the axe to Nick, and his trembling hands took it. I looked at Darren, who motioned for us to look back at the thing. I definitely didn't want to, but Nick started again, shaping his peephole, and he quickly showed me through which I should also look. I saw the woman crawling back on all 4s to the others. After a grunt, she too fell on all 4s and began to run deeper into the forest, like a primate. It was unsettling to watch, and I just wanted to abort this whole adventure so we could save ourselves. Nick urged me to take photos as they ran away, but I didn't move. This wasn't the work of a serial killer, but of a tribe of humanoids. They were obviously isolated for a reason. We waited a few minutes before emerging from our hides. We didn't hear much, so the coast must be clear. I tried to convince the others to turn back, but they said they needed more evidence and wanted something harder. Specifically, they were looking for the place where these creatures lived. I understood their desire, but these things were clearly hostile. They were also fast. Would the 3 of us even be enough? Did they have tools, or did they tear their victims apart? We didn't know much. Nick was fascinated by these beings. He said it was definitely them, and that we would have the big story in no time. He was clearly the eager one in the group, as Darren was somewhat more hesitant than before. After a short catch of breath, I nervously followed the 2 deeper into the forest. We had half an hour before my alarm went off, and I would do my best to stick to it. These things we saw left footprints. They were large, likely to make a Bigfoot witness proud. Their scraping ankles also left marks on the ground. As another gust of wind blew through the forest, I tried to take in my surroundings to calm myself. The wind only moved the underbrush slightly, and the leaves and pines rustled in the breeze. It was the only thing I could hear, giving me a brief moment of peace. The forest itself was beautiful and green, given the circumstances. I kept an eye on the timer and marked the trees accordingly. These things wouldn't hide, would they? The gruesome statues we kept encountering proved we were heading in the right direction. There was even a corpse bound to a tree that looked almost completely eaten. The corpse itself was patched together with a mix of dirty clothes and something sturdy, like tangled denim. That was my best guess, as much of the shirt and jeans on the corpse were almost completely torn off. I was horrified, as they hung quite high above the ground. It was just another thing I had to be aware of. If these damned beings could climb trees, we would be even more vulnerable. Given their size, we would at least hear them climb, I hoped. Darren said he would keep an eye on the trees while Nick and I focused on the front. Eventually, there was a gap in the forest edge that we quickly reached. It looked like a field. We would be exposed and definitely observed if we weren't already. We heard primitive sounds from further ahead again. Instinctively, we knew what to do. The three of us ducked behind some cover as we saw what awaited us in the field. Darren deployed the peephole strategy, and this time I pulled out a pair of binoculars. In the distant distance, something seemed large, and I wanted to observe it safely. I looked through the binoculars and immediately went pale as I saw what was down there. In the field ahead, I saw an abandoned dump truck and a few heavily rusted vans. These things must date back several decades. They didn't look like they belonged to our time, and were so unused that nature had begun to reclaim them. Weeds and tall grass overtook the ground around the old vehicles. These creatures patrolled around them. With my panicked brain, I counted at least 18. They resembled the ones we had seen before, with a few exceptions. The male humanoids I saw had painted bodies and wore some bones as armor. Their teeth sticking out from their heads looked as if they were carved, like perfect daggers. There were also shorter humanoids running around, looking mutated, some of them having too many fingers or nipples. Seeing one running around while devouring a severed human arm sent a chill down my spine. I didn't want to believe it, but these beings ate humans. I could see piles of corpses, and not far from them was another pile of bones. Given the clothing, I'd say it was the forestry team and people working on new roads. I saw 4 adult humanoids picking up a corpse and beginning to pull the limbs with significant force. Some even used their teeth to finish the job. They tossed meat scraps to the smaller ones, who eagerly ate them off the ground without using their hands. The creepiest part was that the trucks were surrounded by massive structures resembling the skeleton of a native lodge. Very minimalist frameworks, with skin pieces as coverings. Somehow, pieced together to hold, I saw various skin tones combined. Some even had hair on them. Bones were also used in some of the constructions. There were also a few of these lodges between which the humanoids shuffled. In the middle of the lodges was a huge pile that looked like clothing, bags, even food and bottles. The clothing came in all different shapes, colors, and sizes. Much of the food looked spoiled, and the bottles resembled something from the early 1950s. Didn't these things know how to use them, let alone what they were? No wonder it wasn't on the map. Everyone and everything sent to build this place probably met an early end like what we were witnessing. I guess people back then decided to limit their losses and abandon development. But these cannibals, where did they come from? It was clear we had found a village, a damned cannibal village in the middle of nowhere. I dropped the binoculars in shock. We had our evidence. Nick just needed to take a snapshot, and we were out. I handed Nick my trembling camera and asked him to just blindly take a photo of the field so we could start our escape. I looked behind me to ensure I could see a tape mark, which I did. I placed it right next to the hanging man. Our escape plan was now. It was bright daylight, and I wanted to take advantage of that. I made sure to quickly mark our location on the GPS. My task was done. Now we had to leave. Darren stared into the field with the binoculars, his face quickly shifting from curious to contorted to a look of disgust. I started pulling at their bulky butts as I felt my alarm begin to vibrate. It was my alarm, and it was playing a loud tone. Did something in my pocket crank up my ringtone? Maybe it was the multiple jumps into the hideout. Luckily for me, I quickly turned it off. Time was up. I hoped that if there was a God who had somehow created these things, he would hear my prayers and not draw the cannibals' attention to us. I heard no change in the inhuman grunting and clattering from the field. A massive, loud gust of wind, almost blowing my phone out of my hands, hit us. Given what I had seen, a breeze in the forest no longer calmed me. Darren handed the binoculars back to me. As he turned to me, he suddenly recoiled. Then I heard something moving in the forest behind us. He immediately grabbed my axe and held it tightly. I had the bear spray ready to see this. I didn't want to turn around, but for my life I knew I had to. I did it quickly to get it behind me, my heart racing faster than ever before. Right next to the hanging man was a smaller cannibal who was feasting on the last remains of the corpse. Then, with a curious grunt, his gray, protruding eyes fixed on me.